Hello, everyone. This is Knowledgia, the Spanish-American War explained in 11 minutes. It's 11 minutes and 30 seconds, so we'll see.
The Spanish-American War brought about the end of Spanish colonial relevance in the Americas and a new chapter for the United States. While the conflict itself was between Spain and the United States, it actually stemmed from dissension in Cuba as the Cubans fought to gain their independence from the Spaniards. Despite the fact that the United States refrained from becoming involved in the first Cuban movement for independence, known as the 10-Year War, which began in 1868, the young nation took a much different approach the second time around, when Cuban rebels came together once again in 1895 to demand freedom from Spain's colonial rule. The United States became exceedingly interested as well as sympathetic. And because you're a fan of our channel, we encourage you to play War Planet Online. This is a real-time strategy game that you can play on your phone or on your computer. You can build your base, stockpile your troops, and wait World Planet Online army and rule the world. U.S. journalism became focused on the events happening with their neighbors, especially due to the significantly harsh reaction from Spain. Some newspapers utilized yellow journalism to push the country in the direction of joining the conflict, and the urge was further fortified by the sudden and unexplained sinking of the USS Maine in the Havana harbor. The United States battleship, which cost upwards of $2 million, fell victim to an unanticipated explosion on February 15, 1898, which killed 260 of the American crew members aboard. The ship had been sent to Havana to aid American citizens who had gotten stuck in the new rebellion, while the official U.S. Naval Court of Inquiry simply blamed a mine for the blast, not pointing any fingers directly at Spain. The American people seemed convinced that the culprit was obvious, and even Congress called for a declaration of war on Spain. On April 25, 1898, they got their wish. Initially, U.S. President Grover Cleveland declared neutrality at the start of Cuba's revolution, but anti-Spain sentiment grew as General Valeriano Weyler enacted a new Spanish reconcentration policy, forcing thousands of Cubans into areas guarded by Spanish troops that lacked basic levels of sanitation, food, and shelter, with the punishment for refusing being swift execution. General Weyler, who was serving as Governor General of Cuba, also implemented martial law across the entire country. Likely due to the already prevalent use of yellow journalism and American sympathy for the Cubans, the actions of General Weyler compelled President Cleveland to alter his stance and announced that the United States might intercede depending on how Spain continued to handle the Cuban contention. As William McKinley replaced Grover Cleveland in 1897, the U.S. became more and more keen to intervene. When a letter from the Spanish Foreign Minister Enrique Dupuy de Lomé criticizing President McKinley was published by the New York Journal on February 9, 1898, things began to rapidly escalate, and with the sinking of the USS Maine occurring less than a week later, there was a swift move towards war happening from that.
Why did he criticize him? Just because he was the next president in line? Or maybe he criticized him because he thought America was getting rather involved in something that didn't concern them, maybe? I don't know.
That point on, along with their declaration of war against Spain, the United States also came up with the Teller Amendment, insisting that they had no intention of trying to seize power or authority over Cuba. The actual warfare between the U.S. and Spain began at the Battle of Manila Bay in the Philippines, where a huge chunk of the Spanish Pacific Naval Fleet was located. United States Commodore George Dewey received orders to head towards the Philippines before the April 25th declaration of war even occurred, putting him and the U.S. Asiatic Squadron in the perfect position to strike after they had arrived at Manila Bay on May 1st. In the early hours of the morning, Commodore Dewey told one of his captains, "You may fire when ready." After a couple of hours, the Spanish fleet was all but demolished, so Dewey called for a break and ordered his crews a second breakfast. Still, some Spanish ships remained and refused to surrender, so the conflict started up again in the latter half of the morning. Finally, once the afternoon came around, the remaining Spaniards officially surrendered. Even though the American fleet was able to effortlessly desecrate the Spanish opponent, Dewey still lacked enough troops to seize Manila completely, which was now in the hands of Filipino revolutionaries until another 15,000 US soldiers reached the bay at the end of July, and the men launched an attack on Manila on August 13th. Commodore Dewey and Wesley Merritt, the leader of the US land troops that came to the Navy's aid, began what is often known as the Mock Battle of Manila. Essentially, the Spaniards had decided they would rather give up the Philippines to the Americans, not the Filipinos. As a result, while the US land soldiers held the revolutionaries back from the battlefield, the rest of the American troops fought an essentially fake skirmish with the Spanish forces, providing an excuse for the exchange of power between the warring sides. Teodoro Angoncillo, a historian who wrote about the event, stated the few casualties on both sides in the phony attack were due to some actors bungling their lines, or possibly to the fact that very few officers were let in on the charade. Nonetheless, the stunt was successful, and Spain was able to hand over control of the Philippines, which they had dominated for over 300 years, to the militarily superior United States, as opposed to the local revolutionary fighters, and essentially passed off responsibility for the strife in the region to the Americans. Back in June, after the first battle at Manila Bay, the US had focused their efforts on the Spanish stronghold of Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. Conflict officially broke out on June 6th and lasted until June 10th, with the results being less innocuous for the Americans this time. At the start of the battle, the US troops were heavily outnumbered in terms of
Lightsabers are finally a reality, and you can own one. This new military flashlight is basically a lightsaber that fits in your pocket. But be warned, this $600 flashlight is not a toy. It's so powerful that it can melt through anything. It can even start a fire, making it the perfect survival tool.
You're kicking me. What are you doing? Stop kicking.
Outnumbered in terms of manpower, with a mere 600 Marines and 300 Cuban militia fighters, though they also possessed 2 auxiliary cruisers, 1 gunboat, 1 steamer, 1 battleship, and 1 light cruiser. The Spanish personnel amounted to 5,000 infantrymen, as well as boasting 7 artillery pieces, 1 shore battery, 1 blockhouse, and 1 fort. Despite their disadvantage, the American naval troops entered the bay on June 6th and successfully attacked a Spanish blockhouse with their light cruiser. Any Spanish vessels attempting to intervene did so in vain. The following day, the American troops were able to cut off all outside communication to and from the Spanish forces by cutting every cable in Guantanamo Bay. Over the next few days, the US and Cuban troops were able to win over control of the bay through a series of minor clashes until the overall hostility came to an end on the 10th. Meanwhile, the Spanish and American troops clashed again at San Juan Hill on July 1st. U.S. General William Shafter commanded his forces to besiege the village of El Caney, along with San Juan Hill clashing with some 500 Spanish troops defending the village, as roughly 8,000 American soldiers pushed forward to San Juan Hill. The U.S. casualties began to add up, but the troops pushed on and eventually split into 2 flanks. The goal was to take both San Juan Hill and Kettle Hill. Under one flank, aiming for Kettle Hill, fought the Rough Riders, which was one of 4 volunteer regiments put together on the side of the Americans. The Rough Riders, alongside the 9th and 10th Cavalry Regiments, led the charge up Kettle Hill as the U.S. eventually captured both targets. Having no plan of stopping there, the Americans entered the city of Santiago the next day, and U.S. naval forces destroyed the Spanish fleet as Admiral Pascual Soriva and his troops from Santiago attempted to flee on July 3rd.
I'm sorry, I just want to go back to that. Hey, stop! 1 killed, 1 wounded, to 343, 151 wounded, 1889 captured, 4 armored cruisers sunk, 2 destroyers sunk. Wow. 4 armored cruisers and 2 destroyers. So everything. Oh wow. So they captured and wounded. If that was all sunk, then they just were picking people up out of the water. Or maybe they swam to shore, but you understand what I'm saying.
Santiago attempted to flee on July 3rd. 2 weeks later, the Spaniards surrendered the city and subsequently ended the war. The formal conclusion to the war came on December 10th, 1898, when a treaty was signed in Paris where Spain gave up all dominion in Cuba, Guam, and Puerto Rico. Authority over Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines was to be transferred to the United States, although the U.S. would owe Spain $20 million for the latter. While this treaty ended the Spanish-American War, it sparked the Philippine-American War that would come the following year. Due to America's promise not to claim hegemony over Cuba, though, the former Spanish colony was finally independent. For both sides of the war, the events of the struggle were notably significant. For Spain, they ended its overseas colonial endeavors and shifted its focus onto its own domestic needs, prompting a new phase of growth and development, both culturally and economically. For the United States, the aftermath was quite different. The Treaty of Paris solidified U.S. overseas expansion and prompted the United States to become a much more important global power. Although some anti-imperialists condemned the U.S., deeming the government to be hypocritical for their disapproval of European expansionist empires, whilst leaning in the direction of becoming one of their own. Even so, the American people supported the actions and belief of their government and were not dissuaded by the consequences of such policies. Ultimately, the Spanish-American War in some ways reversed the roles of Spain and the United States, putting a halt to the expansion of one while inducing the expansion of the other.
That was good. I knew a little bit about it. I have a 2-hour video, but it doesn't exactly tell you everything. And this kind of hit the highlights. Well, I'm going to end this here because it's 7:05 and I want to relax a little bit. I've had a couple drinks, feel good. So I'm going to go ahead and call it. And it's called I'm going to go tinkle out of my ding ding, but everyone else, you have a good day, good night.